Tensions also between Japan and South Korea have intensified after Seoul accused its neighbour of violating international law. South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Hyun-chong said Japan had breached WTO principles of free trade and international law by imposing unilateral export curbs against South Korea. Earlier, South Korea urged Japan to accept its request for another round of talks over its export controls. That's a proposal South Korean officials made last week during working-level talks with their Japanese counterpart. Now, the trade dispute comes amid a long-running row over wartime labor. Earlier today, Japan summoned South Korea's ambassador after the deadline passed for Seoul to accept third-country arbitration for forced labor disputes. During a tense meeting, Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono demanded South Korea take corrective measures for a previous ruling. Now, South Korea's Supreme Court ruled last year that 2 Japanese firms compensate wartime workers, but Japan argued that these compensations were already settled in the 1965 treaty. Our correspondent Michio Ishida has more from Tokyo.
The start of the talks between Foreign Minister Taro Kono and South Korean ambassador to Japan was a tense one. Mr. Kono expressed his disappointment that South Korea did not appoint an arbitrator in response to the former wartime workers' court's verdict. The ambassador then said South Korea had an alternative proposal, that is, to set up a fund to compensate the plaintiff. Mr. Kono raised his voice slightly and said the proposal is not acceptable. You see, in 2015, with then South Korean President Park Geun-hye, Japan set up a fund for former comfort women, but President Moon is reported to be disabling this fund, so the Japanese government does not trust Seoul. Regarding the wartime laborers, the background is this. Last year, South Korea's Supreme Court decided Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries were liable in respect to claims for damages by former wartime workers from the Korean Peninsula. However, Japan's position is wartime issues have been settled under the bilateral 1965 agreement, which says claims between the contracting 2 parties and their nationals are settled completely and finally. And Japan supplied in total $500 million in loans and grants, which at the time was twice the size of South Korea's GDP. Now, Japan is upset the South Korean government did not follow the bilateral agreement and has been requesting for diplomatic consultations, but South Korea did not respond to the request, and so Japan invoked the arbitration clause of the 1965 agreement, which requires both sides to set up an arbitration board. And the deadline was Thursday. South Korea did not comply. If the court decision supersedes the bilateral agreement, then the assets of Japanese companies could be sold to compensate the plaintiffs within this year. Next, the Japanese government may consider taking the matter to the International Court of Justice. The 2 sides are also in conflict over Japan's decision this month to impose export control over 3 items to South Korea needed to make semiconductors. Now, South Korea is reported seeking another round of talk with Japan after a 5-hour working-level session last week. But Japan's stance is it's explained the background and will respond to further questions via email. There are concerns the rift will spill over to people-to-people ties of both countries. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.